Hello, you're listening to Michelle Marie McGrath of the Unclassified Woman podcast series, and today I'm delighted to be speaking to one of my favourite ladies, Julie Parker. Now, Julie is one of Australia's foremost life and business coaches and trainers with more than a decade's experience inspiring hundreds of clients and thousands of people to create beautiful lives and businesses. She is the CEO and founder of the Beautiful You Coaching Academy. Julie passionately trains and supports heart-centered, gifted people to bring their talents and love of giving into the world as life coaches. Julie's a published author and TedX speaker and has shared a speaking stage with amazing ladies such as Clare Bowditch, Christina Re, Gretel Killeen, Carolyn, Cresswell and Gala. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Australia Day Citizenship Award and Business and Professional Women's Woman of Achievement Award. She appears regularly in the media, including Today Tonight, A Current Affair, Sunrise and The Morning Show, as well as in publications such as Grazia, Cleo, Cosmopolitan, Fitness and Health, and national newspapers. She's also the editor-in-chief of the fabulous Inspired Coach magazine. She lives in Melbourne with her husband, stepdaughter, and two much-loved adopted cats. So welcome, Julie. So happy to be speaking to you today.
Oh, and I'm so happy to be speaking to you, Michelle. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really thrilled to be here.
To start us off, Julie, would you mind sharing a little bit about whether or not you had not had a child due to personal choice or through circumstances?
Yeah, well, you would kind of think that this would be a fairly straightforward question to answer. But in fact, I feel as though me and my story in regards to it is a little bit of a mixture of both. Because honestly, if anybody had ever told me growing up in a traditional country farming family where women played quite traditional roles of mother and wife, that I was not going to have children, I really would have thought, even up to the age of being 27, 28, even 30, that I would have really thought that they were crazy, because I had always thought that I would have children and that I would have, be a biological mother.
Yeah.
However, what is happening and to so many women and happened to me is that I really found myself in my early to mid 30s and had still not met the person, the man that was meant to be my mate for life. And so I started to have to think differently about that circumstance. And even though I knew that I still had time, I started to sense and feel that maybe it was something that might not happen for me. And really interestingly, possibly by coincidence or not, I began to have some significant gynecological problems at that time.
Right.
And it turned out that, I got that look from the doctors that kind of said, hurry up, girl. If you want to have children, you really need to think about having them now, because, things are not looking so great down there, and, viability is sleeping away, and et cetera, et cetera. But I certainly didn't feel as though I was in a position to have a child on my own.
Yeah.
It was not something that I really, that I wanted. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, we need to think about, plan 2, all of that sort of thing. And then interestingly enough, again, whether coincidentally or not, I then met my future husband, who had been married before and had a child from that marriage. And when we first started to date and go out together, he was very lovingly honest and upfront with me right from the very beginning and said, look, I really like you and think that you're fabulous, but I want to let you know something. I don't have a desire to have any more children. And he said, I feel as though this is something that's very important to let you know about right from the outset of, our time together. And my response to that actually really was surprising to me. I had thought to myself that if anybody had ever said that it automatically would have ended for me. That, that would have been, well, we're not meant to be together because I want to have children. And that was not my response at all. And now looking back at that, I realised it was because, a couple of months in, I knew that I had found my mate. Yeah. I knew that I had found the man that I was going to marry and be with. I felt it in my heart and soul probably by about day 2, in all honesty. Yeah. I think sometimes we really know these things.
Yeah.
And suddenly for me, Michelle, what happened was having children suddenly was really not as important to me anymore. What was more important to me was building a beautiful life with this man and becoming a stepmother to his daughter, who was 7 at the time when I first met her. She's now 16, almost 17 years old, and she lives the bulk of her time with her mum, and she spends every second weekend and holidays with us. And my desire to have children of my own greatly lessened, and I felt very at peace and very happy with knowing that that was what he wanted, and also knowing that it was going to be more than likely, from a physical perspective, a really hard road for me to have children. And so I thought to myself, you know what, this is not the way I thought things would turn out, but I actually feel really okay about this. And it's turned out to be exactly what was meant to happen for me. And we did not decide, obviously, here being on this podcast, I didn't attempt to change his mind, or I didn't leave the relationship because that was what I wanted. I really realised that by the time we got married when I was 37, that it was just no longer something that I felt was I needed or wanted or was going to be a part of my life. And I believe for a lot of different reasons, which we can, of course, go into and talk about, it's turned out to be a combination of both circumstance, but really in the end, actual choice that has been one of the best choices for me that I have made in my life.
I think that, like you were saying, that it was great that he was so clear and upfront with you from the outset about how he felt about that. But I think that's a situation that's also becoming increasingly common, whereby, obviously people don't always meet somebody very young and then stay with them for the rest of their lives, because we're living longer and longer. So more women are meeting their partner who may already have children in a similar situation like that, and they, feel that they don't necessarily want any more. And, so it is something that more and more women are having to consider, as, families come in all shapes and sizes and forms, don't they, these days, so that's, I think that's a really interesting, and also it's a very interesting, and also it's one of the reasons maybe why there are less women of, 40 and over who are with children of their own biologically these days.
Yes. Yeah, I'm absolutely certain that would be part of it. I think the experience of being a woman in the 21st century is so very different.
Yes.
To what it was like, last century or even 15 or 20 years ago, where from a family perspective, I'm not necessarily so sure that it is for men.
Yes.
From a relationship, not even just family, but from a relationships and partnerships and family and children perspective. But I think for women, it is. And I think for men it is a bit, but not as much as it is for women.
Not
and
as
this is why we have, so many women who traditionally in our mother's time and grandmother's time, well and truly would have been married by the time they were 26, 27 years old.
Yeah, or younger even.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They were having their first babies by then.
Yeah.
And now it's very different. People are getting married and partnering later in life. They're having children later in life. And or they're not finding that right person for them to match up with and have children with. And I certainly know that has happened with many, many women that I know.
Yeah.
That and so they, through circumstance, they would have liked to have had children, and even for some, like to have gotten married, but at this point in time in their life, that hasn't eventuated like it would have done, say, for example, in their mother's day.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking like my grandparents met when they were 19, and
I think mine were married when they were that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's just, it's kind of, we are making these decisions, it seems, as well, later and later in life. And obviously we're an increasingly aging population, as we know. And so, of course, that is sort of impacting, isn't it, all of these different sort of, there's all these different variables within those dynamics. Yes, it's very interesting. And so did you feel, Julie, like when you and sort of Glenn talked about that and you thought, okay, so that's not going to be my situation, I'm not going to be a biological mother, were there any, I would imagine that even though you then sort of felt quite clear about it, it still would have brought up some things for you to kind of process and look at. Obviously you'd have friends that have children and all that kind of thing. I mean, did you have any sort of interesting responses from friends and family, or were they just very supportive?
No, there was one interesting response from a friend, and an interesting response from my mother about the decision. And you are right. I did have to think very carefully about, was this going to be something I would regret?
Yeah, because I think that's a big question, isn't it, for some people, and it's, which is fair enough,
Would I, if handed a baby, suddenly dissolve into tears and, think, and all of those sorts of things. And I did really think a great deal about that and spent a lot of time reflecting and really spent a lot of time with myself. To tell you the truth, I was not particularly keen to have a lot of open conversations about it with other people, even with close girlfriends, because I really realised within myself that this had to be my decision, and I had to be the one that was either okay with it or not okay with it, which would have meant the relationship, potentially dissolving or entering into one of those terrible tug of wars that we see people do where, it's like, I'll change his mind sort of thing,
which is crazy.
I was not interested in that. I was not interested in that at all. And I thought to myself, no, I need to be the one that's really clear about this decision. So mostly I spent a lot of just reflective time with myself. But when I mentioned it to my best friend, who, by the way, is a mum of 4, so very different to me in life circumstance, she has always been, brutally honest and very straightforward and direct, and it's one of the things that I most love and admire about her. She was really taken aback and quite shocked, and she said, "Oh, really?" She said, "And are you really, really, really sure?" And she asked me a lot of hard and fast questions, which I never minded, but at the same time, I have always found it interesting when that has been someone's response to someone making a decision that they're not going to have children.
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody either just naturally says, yes, we will have children, that nobody asks them any questions about that.
Absolutely.
Well, why do you want to do that? And, all of those it just seems to be a given. So when somebody says, that they're not going to do that, it does for some people, I think, raise a lot of suspicion almost, or questions that maybe I think she felt concerned that I was being pushed into it and that I was compromising in some way.
Yeah.
And I said to her, no, I said, that's, I've spent a lot of time coming to this decision for me and about our relationship together, and I feel really good about it. My mother was the one that I was most worried about telling, even though she had been aware that I had, physical health issues in that area and that it may never happen anyway. I think telling her, a really traditional lady, single mother, she'd worked in, of all things, childcare all her life, looking after babies and little children, to have her eldest daughter say, we're making the decision not to have children, I thought was going to be really devastating for her. I thought she would be really upset by it and really worried about it. And her response really, really, really surprised me. And she just simply asked me a question. She said, "Are you happy?" And I said, "Never, ever been happier in my life." And she said, "Well, carry on, Macduff."
Exactly. Yeah.
That was it. And, we talked about it later, actually a couple of days before I got married, and she said to me, "Children do not a marriage make."
No.
And she said, "It's you and Glenn and the partnership that you're going to form that is now, the cornerstone and foundation and rock of your life. And that's what it's all about." And she said, "It's not about whether or not you have children together." So 2 very different responses, but everybody else was just like, "Oh, okay, no worries," or it wasn't even raised as a subject. Some people ask, "We're going to have kids," and it's like, no, we're not. I'm just focusing and concentrating on our partnership, my business, and my stepdaughter. So when she's with us, and I get to take on that role in her life.
And that's again, that's a very important point. So obviously you have got this relationship with a stepdaughter, with this young lady now that, you would not have, it would have been different, so it's interesting that, now more and more step families, of course, it's becoming much more the norm. I've got 2 step parents myself, and it's just, again, it brings a totally different dynamic and a different relationship. But again, so many, I suppose, benefits and gifts as well through that connection.
Oh, completely. Absolutely. And she is just one of the great joys of my life, and having watched her grow from being a little girl and, playing with dolls and horses and all of those sorts of things to now be a young lady talking about university courses and things like that. It's such a privilege. A step parent's role is not an easy one.
No.
At times, but I feel very, very blessed that I have just been so loved and embraced by her. And that's because I'm certain that a very, very deep portion of that is because her dad is such a wonderful father. See, sometimes people make the assumption that, whether man or woman, that they don't want to have any more children because they don't like being a parent, or because, I'm not sure whether that's the right phrase, or whether, they just think I couldn't do it over again, or it's really challenging or difficult, or whatever it may mean. But that wasn't the case, at all. He just felt at a stage in his life where he was deeply happy and loving of the one child that he had, and was focused on building a beautiful relationship with her, and didn't feel as if there was, need and or want for more.
Yeah. So he just felt very complete in that.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I was talking to Amy Smith of the Joy Junkie in the US. I love Amy. Yeah, and she raised quite an interesting point because, as you know, her and her husband have always been very clear that that's, not something that they wanted. And her husband made an interesting comment saying that he wondered if there were more people who just felt very fulfilled within themselves and in their own lives, and then within their primary relationship, he wondered if less people would make that choice, because he sort of wondered if unconsciously, and not always unconsciously, if some people feel that maybe there's something missing, maybe there's a void, and they unconsciously assume a child will fill whatever that perceived lack is, and I'm not saying that's always the case at all, but I thought that was a really interesting point. So,
I think it's a very interesting and a very valid point, because I've certainly known, even a couple of girls that I went to high school with, that I think if they were really honest with themselves, in getting married and having children quite young in this day and age, sort of 24, 25, did that from the perspective that the thing that they most wanted and felt that they needed was to be a mother and to have children. And as we know, particularly in this day and age in modern society, who you are at 24 is very, very different to who you are at, say, 34 or 44.
Absolutely.
And as we know, we now have, many, many women finding themselves become, with relationships breaking down because of choices made at such a young age.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, everyone has a different path. My sister is the exact opposite to me. She got married very young. Well, not very young. I'm not talking like a teenager, but in her mid-20s, which is young.
Very
these
young.
days.
It is young.
And had 2 children and, plays a maternal instincts play a very, very strong role in her life. So this is not a genetic thing. Everyone is different, I think, in their pursuit of what happiness and what a really loving and fulfilled life means for them.
Absolutely. And so you've got your own wonderful business and you're training life coaches all over the world. And so, really, in that way, you are nurturing, all of these budding life coaches. And I've been very lucky to have done, it's a wonderful course, which I'd recommend to anyone, even if they didn't want to be a coach. I think it's something that's it's a great personal, exploration and personal development course that really makes you look at, all parts of yourself and what makes you and, all of that. So I think that would be, it's valuable for anyone. And so through that, you're encouraging all of these people and you are using those nurturing and mothering qualities in that way.
Oh, absolutely. I often feel like genuinely that I'm mum to hundreds.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm this big mama bear that is, holding close to her heart the lives and businesses of so many incredible people from all around the world. And I think that that's one of the myths that goes with women who are childless or particularly child-free by choice, and that is that they do not have that warm, nurturing instinct. And it's so wrong. It's so wrong. Anybody that met me or knew me, and I know that this would be exactly the same whether I'd been a stepmother or not, knows that I'm incredibly warm and nurturing and giving. And I think that, so much of the myths that surround women that are child-free, really stem back hundreds and hundreds of years. This is like witchcraft sort of stuff.
Yeah.
When, that single woman in the village without children, or, unmarried, spinster.
With 10 cats.
Yeah, that sort of thing. She's trouble, she's not motherly, she's a witch, she's to be looked at or watched carefully and, all those sorts of things, because there must be something wrong with her because she hasn't got married, she hasn't had children.
Yes.
And that means that she's not a real woman, whatever that might mean, or she's not acceptable to us, or she's a threat in some way because she's different.
And it's also that thing, sometimes the assumption of, oh, you don't like kids, which is total nonsense,
Yes.
You know, you could, so many women, you know, Melanie Notkin, who's the author of Savvy Auntie and Motherhood, she uses the phrase a lot, child full. And it's for women who have got, you know, really great relationships with their nieces, nephews, godchildren, stepchildren, their friends' children. They might have a life that's actually full of children, but just not ones that they've given birth to physically, you know.
Oh, completely. And I've never heard that expression before, but that's very much me. You know, I'm randomly trying to count in my head at the moment. It's like I'm godmother to 2. I have 3 nieces and 4 nephews and godmother to 3 actually. So it's just children everywhere.
Absolutely.
Children everywhere.
And one of the sort of questions that I had been sort of asking people, thinking about, which I think is really interesting, that when I looked at the different definitions of the verb to mother, one of the explanations that it comes up with is to give rise to or to produce.
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's really fascinating. And
that is beautiful, actually. I love that.
Yeah, and we all do that in different ways, don't we? You know?
Absolutely, we do.
And
absolutely.
So how would you say that's sort of relevant for you? What brings you fulfillment in that way?
Oh, look, I just couldn't go past thinking about all of the life coaches that train with us in our life coaching school, because, you know, many of them come to us wanting to birth a business.
Yes.
You know, they want to birth and emerge as a life coach, such a helping, giving profession, and they want to birth their own business and their own new reality for themselves as an entrepreneur and a business owner and somebody who is making an authentic, incredible living out of doing something so heart-centered and passionate. And so, you know what, if that's what I have been brought here to do, is to help all of these people, 99% of whom are women, give rise to that in them, I am just so absolutely thrilled with that. And, of course, combined with the role that I play in Sinead's life.
Yes.
You know, there are 2 very different circumstances there. But when you mention that term of, you know, giving rise to, that's exactly what happens when people train with us and go through this course. You know, they rise up.
Yes.
And, you know, they step out into the world with newfound confidence and skills, many of them with established businesses and already working with clients.
Absolutely. And so in terms of looking at the meaning around, like, obviously mothering, nurturing, how would you apply that to yourself? Like, how do you nurture yourself on like a physical, mental, emotional level?
Well, you know, I've never really been one much for routine when it comes to these sorts of things. I feel as if I nurture myself where I feel that it's needed, and or I know within myself that if I sustain a lovely practice, that keeps me topped up, so to speak. So, you know, beautiful things physically, such as, you know, I love your alchemical oils, using those on my physical body, I find to be really nurturing and beautiful. Meditation, long baths, good wine.
Of course.
And all of, you know, being outdoors, you know, my garden brings me great joy. Spending time with all of those children, very nurturing and wonderful, filled with laughter. Work, you know, I find my work very nurturing. Like anyone who runs their own business, it can be overwhelming at times, but it's also very, very giving. And I think when I think about mentally, for me, I mentioned meditation, but truly for me, one of the most important things that I feel that I do that contributes to me having a really wonderful life where I feel nurtured and loved and protected and amazing about who I am and the role that I'm playing in the world, is to surround myself with just truly, truly incredible people. Yeah. You know, I gave up the knockers and the turkeys and the difficult conflictual relationships and the passive aggressives many, many, many years ago. I don't know exactly what happened when I was in my 20s, or maybe it was in my teens, but I have always been very, very blessed to be surrounded by beautiful women and some men as well. And I have nurtured and cultured those relationships for dear life, because I knew, as somebody that grew up in a small country farming community and was going to need to move away to the big city and start my own life, that I needed to have friends, and I needed to have the best friends and people around me that I possibly could. My husband has always joked, not that we ever will, I believe this so deeply in my heart. He has always said to me, we're never getting divorced, because he said, I can't live without your friends.
Hilarious.
He said, you have magnificent friends. He said, no, I'm not giving them up. He said, they're mine now too.
So true. But it is, isn't it? And like you, I agree. I just have the most incredible, amazing, inspiring women in my life. And it's interesting, actually, that sort of brings me to something that I was just thinking about. Of one of the things that we have these days also is what's known as social infertility, where there's this increasingly group of women who are successful, accomplished, they've got very fulfilling lives, but then they're just not meeting men who they would like to have a family with. They just can't meet somebody who's kind of on the same page as them. So there seems to be this growing phenomena around that, which is very interesting as women become more empowered and, I suppose make increasingly different and varied choices about their lives. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it is a social phenomenon.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. And I think that as a society, we still really are not quite certain what it's all about. There's so many different varying opinions, some of them horrendous, such as, women are being too picky, all of these sorts of different critiques, I think, that really are just, slights against women. But I also think it has to do with men, and their choices are changing as well.
Yeah.
We have men who don't necessarily want to have children.
Yeah.
And some women, many women who do. And so that's creating a mismatch, and there's all sorts of things.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, money is also a factor here as well. So many women do not really, really get on their feet, and men too, I think. They're living at home longer.
Yes.
It's so expensive to go to university and study. It's becoming hugely expensive in all areas of the world to buy your own home.
Absolutely.
And have that, and so what's happening is that people are working harder for longer, studying harder for longer, and things such as love and romance and connection kind of taking a little bit of a back seat, because let's face it, who wants to get married and start married life living at home with mum and dad?
Yes.
Some people do it, and I really admire them. For me, I couldn't have imagined anything worse.
No. And it's funny that you're talking about the expenses and the costs of things. I was reading a report recently by AMP, which is about the average cost of raising a child. And oh my goodness. And they just went through and they looked at 3 different income brackets, so you had like your blue collar worker, white collar, looked at this whole variance, and the average amount was just under $500,000.
Is that all? I actually thought it would have been even more.
Well, it can be more than that, depending on, like, if you were sort of in the sort of, upper income level brackets. But it was kind of, that was around the average. Yeah. So it was kind of the average of, it was around $500,000 just for up until the age of about 18. Yeah. And so it was very interesting because it was looking at, like the 0 to 4 years, of course, people setting themselves up with equipment, clothes, all of these things. And then again, when you've got children who are going into sort of like education, sort of, when making that decision whether they'll go to uni and all that kind of thing, and just the expense involved in all of that. And you think, well, wow, it's just kind of, it's astronomical,
That is astronomical, when you put it like that and you start to think about those figures, you think, wow.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it varies slightly. Apparently, if you have like a second or third, it would be slightly less, because obviously you've got the economies of scale there, literally, but just, it's not easy for people, so.
No. It's not. And then on top of all of this, it's not just about the expense and what you provide, but then, of course, you have to attempt to try and be the very best parent that you can.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff that brings and entails. And, it's a big job. There's no question about it.
Absolutely. And so, again, that reinforces that we really have to be very clear about the choices that we're making that are absolutely right for ourselves and for our life, and being the best that we can be in whatever form that's going to take.
Absolutely, Michelle. And we have to respect other people's decisions around what they decide about this part of their life.
Absolutely.
And not question them, or, in a terrible way, or, or feel as if they're making a mistake, or that's selfish, or why would you do that, or you'll end up a lonely old woman, and all of these things. Let's face it still happens.
It
still happens.
It really
people
does.
Still think it, and sometimes they say it out loud to people, sometimes they don't necessarily, but it still happens.
There's
it still
a lot
goes
of judgment.
on.
Yeah.
And a lot of judgment, yes.
Yeah, so it's like, let's bring an end to all the judgment and criticism. I mean, it's so, we can't ever know what's right for somebody else, really.
No, of course we can't. And that's why intuitively, Michelle, I knew that it was not the right decision for me to go talking to a host of girlfriends about the decision that I was making in my life. And I think I knew all along, as I said, when it was first raised with me, instead of having this sort of violent reaction to it, it's like, okay, well, this is over. It was like, okay, I was pretty sure that immediately as it was said to me, this is okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I think I knew, right from the start, this is okay. You are on the verge of what appears to be a really beautiful relationship, and I had not met his daughter by that time. You have a growing, burgeoning, successful business that is taking up a lot of your time. You've got your health back on track after all of those problems. And that was always in the back of my mind. Do I really want to put myself through this? Potentially IVF and a whole heap of other things that were going to be very draining and very expensive.
And no guarantee at the end of them.
Exactly. And I think I just knew. I just knew straight away. And so I didn't have this desire to talk to everybody about it. It's like nobody had ever come to me as a trusted girlfriend and spoken to me about their decision to have children.
Yeah.
So I just think I felt that I never really needed to do it. So I spoke to my best friend and I spoke to my mum, and then I just felt very peaceful about it. And I have felt very, very peaceful about it ever since. My best friend only ever asked me once, a couple of years into the marriage, she said, are you still okay about the kids thing? And I said, you know what, I am. I really, really, really am. And every now and again, Glenn has checked in with me about it too. I would consider myself to be past child-rearing age now. And I've always been able to answer very confidently, totally okay.
Yeah.
Because I feel so happy. I feel so fulfilled.
Absolutely.
And so I live such a blessed and wonderful life. I have a husband who loves me and I love him. A beautiful, beautiful stepdaughter, an amazing business. I just feel very, very fulfilled, and I feel as if, as I said right at the start, it was absolutely the right decision.
On a practical level, I mean, now you've got the flexibility and freedom, and as you say, you're very busy with your business, you're travelling and doing different things. There would have been a lot more to try and juggle if you were also having to factor in a young child to that.
Oh, of course. And I have absolutely, thought about that at varying different times. And I know for sure that my life would be very, very different now. Of course, it would be very different if we had children of our own.
Yeah.
But the biggest difference that there would have been would absolutely have been in relation to my business, which I know would either look very, very, very different to the way it does now, or potentially not even have happened.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, thank you. So interesting, all that. And just one final point I was going to ask you about is I was speaking recently to Jodie Day, who's the author of Rocking Plan B. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that she spoke to me about, which I thought was very interesting, is the realization that for her, she'd really went through a grieving process that she wasn't going to have children because, she had always wanted that. And so one of the things that she talked about was how the realization that, this is the end of my genetic line. I am the result of all of my ancestors, and that is not going to be carried forward from me. I'm not going to be leaving my legacy in that way, So, what sort of legacy am I going to be leaving? And that kind of thing, which, again, very interesting sort of point. So what would you love to leave as your legacy, Julie?
It would be that I hope that I really inspire people to truly embrace themselves for who they are and love themselves for exactly who they are and all of the choices that they make.
Beautiful.
That if I really feel as if that's probably what I'm here to do, to help people realise that they are enough, that they have beautiful skills and qualities and talents. And obviously the way that I love to bring that out in people is with people who are natural born givers and helpers and want to create an amazing business for themselves as a life coach. But more than anything, just to inspire people to know that they're enough and that they're worthy of love exactly as they are. If that can be a little stamp that I leave behind with me, I'll check out a very happy lady.
Beautiful. I love that. So important. And so, Julie, can you just let people know the best place to find you and to find out more about your work and your course if they want to look into that as well?
Yep, you can simply find us at beautifulyoucoachingacademy.com. That's where we are, and that's where you'll find us there.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and your valuable insights and comments. I loved talking to you about this, and I'm sure it's going to be really helpful for people listening.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, Michelle, and I just really hope that it's helpful for a woman who's out there listening and thinking about these decisions or choices in her life that she's either making or has already made. And I just absolutely love that you're bringing these stories to life. It's fantastic.
Thanks so much, Julie.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Unclassified woman.